of Matthew, chapter 21, verses 10 through 17. When he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in turmoil, asking, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." Then Jesus entered the temple and drove out all who were selling and buying in the temple, and he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, "It is written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer,' but you are making a den of robbers." The blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he cured them. But when the chief priests and scribes saw the amazing things he did, and heard the children crying out in the temple, "Hosanna to the Son of David," they became angry and said, "Do you hear what they are saying?" Jesus said to them, "Yes. Have you never read, 'Out of the mouths of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise for yourself'?" He then left them, went out of the city to Bethany, and spent the night there. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
We're probably wondering, wait a minute, where's the bit with the palm branches? We'll get there. Actually, we just missed it. If you're following along in your Bible, there's actually more that happens on Palm Sundays in Matthew's Gospel than just the triumphal entry, and that's the part we read today. But we'll get to the palm branches in a second. But first, Jesus is an interesting guy, as you might imagine, and he must be, because here we are 2,000 years later still talking about him, and I imagine 1,000 years from now we will still be doing the same. Jesus is actually introduced in the gospel of one of the other gospels, the Gospel of John, with some of the probably most well-known introductory words that we have. And in John's gospel, we are introduced to Jesus when it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God with God, and the Word was God," the Word being Jesus. Like I said, I think those are probably the most profound introductory words that we have, probably in the human language. And the only close second, of course, would be a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Now, yeah, some of you got it right at the beginning of the call to worship, and I love you for that. Thank you so much. Now, this whole sermon isn't going to be about how Jesus was a secret Jedi, or anything like that. Though I will tell you, if you go to an AI image generator and tell it to give me a picture of Jesus as a Jedi with a lightsaber, it will oblige. And it kind of works. I was just like, the same outfit. I mean, it's the same robes. I mean, it's really a lot of ways. It's not, and there's honestly partly a reason for that. And the reason for that is about 100 years ago, somebody identified that throughout a lot of our heroic stories, there's a pattern that has emerged, and in many ways is a pattern that emerges in the storytelling about heroic figures that really, in a lot of ways, begins with Jesus. I mean, there's the story of Jesus' life, who he was, how he lived, what he overcame, and you find it repeated over and over and over again. And today in literature and in movies, it's known as the hero's journey. And the hero's journey has some very basic pieces, and every story doesn't have every component of it, but it has a basic thing that it follows. One is we're introduced to this character. They are called to go on some sort of adventure and do something. Along the way, they receive some sort of supernatural aid or a mentor or somebody who helps them follow along. They face challenges and temptations. They eventually kind of hit the climactic part of the story, in the adventure they call the abyss, which oftentimes involves up to something like their death and rebirth, either metaphorically or physically. And then there's some sort of transformation that happens, and then there's a return back. And in my mind, as I kind of follow that around, I mean, yes, I can absolutely layer the story of Jesus on top of it. I mean, we're introduced to him. He kind of comes out of nowhere. He comes from this humble place. He's given this incredible adventure to go on to proclaim God's good news to all these people, some of which want to hear it, some of which don't. He has aid along the way. Jesus is constantly talking about his Father and the guidance that he's received receiving in that regard. And of course, we are here on the precipice at this moment when, yes, Jesus has come and faced a lot of challenges along the way and overcome them. And of course, we're at the precipice right before we hit the abyss that will come in the week to come. So you could think about Jesus in that way. But if your head went to my head, like my brain does, and we talk about this, you could also say, yes, but that's also the story of Star Wars, and it's the story of Lord of the Rings, and it's the story of the Chronicles of Narnia, and it's the story of, this, that, and the other. And I'm like, well, yes, that is true. There is a pattern to all of this, and in many ways, the originator of the pattern. And in fact, today, you will even hear people when they are doing things like reviews on books and movies and all these sorts of things and stories, you'll often talk and hear about characters being called the Jesus figure. Like, who's the Jesus figure in this story? And because the story of Jesus and what he did and who he was and what he overcame is so pervasive and became so well known, especially part of Western cultures of which we are a part, it's no doubt, it's almost imprinted on all of us. So it shouldn't be a surprise to us when we find that story in other places. And of course, one of the most interesting places for me that we find that story is in the original Star Wars movies. Now, there'll be a lot of spoilers for the first Star Wars movie. That movie is literally 6 months older than me. So, I'm not really going to apologize if you haven't seen it. If you haven't seen it, that's okay. Now, today, on Palm Sunday, we remember a couple of things. We remember the triumphal entry, which, if you've been around church at all, you've no doubt heard the story of Jesus being, telling his disciples to go and find a donkey for him to ride in on, and all those sorts of things. And in Matthew's gospel, when Jesus gives the instruction to say, go and find this donkey, basically steal it, which I think was our sermon last year about it, that basically Jesus is, they're Grand Theft Donkey. It's Grand Theft Donkey. And it brings it back. And then in Matthew, the author says, Jesus does this to fulfill the scripture. And it talks about a prophecy about how the king will come in, how this coming Messiah will come into the city. And it says he will come in humbly on a donkey. Because that is not the way, most kings and rulers and people of importance at the time would make a huge show of coming into the city. That was part of what they did. And the bigger show you could make of coming in, it might involve elephants and camels. I mean, really think about the, Prince Ali coming in the Aladdin movie, right? Like that whole thing, like that's what they would have done. You had no idea there was going to be that much pop culture in this, did you? Love it. But you think about that. Jesus doesn't do that. He does something very simple, much more simple. And he says he does it to fulfill the scripture. Now, we can oftentimes be excused for thinking especially when the Bible goes out of the way to say this thing happened to fulfill this prophecy, that somehow this is just a box that's being checked, right? Like somehow throughout the Bible, there's all these little breadcrumbs, and this is how you'll know, and we're just waiting for Jesus to check all these boxes. Well, it's not entirely the case. Yes, there was a prophecy from the Old Testament that said this is what the king would do, but that's not why Jesus is doing it, right? The prophecy exists for another reason. It exists to show us what kind of person Jesus is and what kind of person and leader Jesus is trying to be. And he's not trying to be the one that is showy and flashy and showing off his wealth and his might. He's the one who comes in humbly on a donkey. And even though he is that one, even though that is how he is coming into the city, people gather to celebrate his coming, which is what they are doing. It's always interesting to see the depictions of this and how this is depicted, in different movies and different places. But this was clearly a celebration. People laid their cloaks and their palm branches on down in front of them because, of course, this is the time before unpaved roads, right? And so the idea of doing this is you're giving someplace a clean place to walk. It's a place of showing honor to the person that is walking in front of them. And so that's what they are doing when they are laying down this basically impromptu paved surface for Jesus and his donkey to walk across. And they're doing it despite the fact that he's not on a horse or an elephant or a camel or doing something majestic or amazing. He's attempting to come in as humbly as he can. Because what the people are there to celebrate is not Jesus' wealth and power. They're coming to celebrate someone that they've heard about. Someone that they've heard about has made a real and actual and important difference, right? They want to come and see and celebrate this person they've heard about, who has healed the sick, right? Who has proclaimed God's kingdom, who has spent time and energy eating with, talking with, and being around the kinds of people that most folks who are part of the better group would not spend time with. Right? Jesus has spent time with the poor, he's spent time with the prostitutes, he's spent time with the sinners, and not to tell them how awful and terrible they are, but to break bread with them, to talk to them about the love that God has for them, and yes, for some, to call them to a better way of living, with the assumption and belief that they can actually start to live in a better way. Something that the people in charge at the time probably didn't believe as much. So they have heard all of these stories because they don't have reality television and they don't have news radio, so they don't have a lot else to talk about. So they've no doubt heard all these stories and they hear this person's actually coming. So they celebrate and they lay down their cloaks and they lay down these palm branches in front of Jesus, not because he has the most impressive parade, but because who he is. And no doubt this captures the attention of not only the people there, but it captures the attention of the religious leaders and the people in charge, who will actually later become very, very important to our story, especially as we travel down the path into the abyss. They celebrate this moment, even though nobody there yet knows, except for really Jesus, where the story's going to go. Nobody yet really knows, except for Jesus, that the hard work is actually yet to come. They are simply looking at everything they have seen up to that point and choosing to take a moment to celebrate it. And I think that's an important reminder for us. There's often a lament that pastors have, that people like, oh, they want to go, all my people want to do is go from the celebration of Palm Sunday to the celebration of Easter and miss the piece in between. And I'm like, that is a challenge, and we really ought not do that. But we also shouldn't look past the point that this today is a day, and Palm Sunday was a celebration. It was something we're celebrating. Everything that Jesus did up into leading to him coming to Jerusalem was important. The life that Jesus lived was important. The example he set was important. The way that he moved through the world was important. That, when we are called to imitate Jesus, is what we are called to imitate. So, of course, we should celebrate that too, knowing that even though the harder work is yet to come. Now, as we read this morning, Jesus doesn't just stop there, right? Doesn't just stop at the entrance and go, great, thanks for all the palm branches, and please pick up your coats now. I'm going to go, have a bite to eat, right? It says instead, he goes into the temple and he does something interesting where he turns over the tables. And at this time, because it's a festival, people would have been coming into the temple. They would have been needing to do their religious work that they knew they were called to do, and they faced a couple of problems. In order to do what they were called to do and offer the sacrifices they were called to offer, one is you had to have something to sacrifice, and most of these people had traveled from far away. Most of them chose not to bring a couple of birds with them. When you're traveling by foot, having a couple of birds in a cage along the way doesn't sound like fun, right? So somebody, some entrepreneurial spirit got up, was like, well, I've got you covered there. I'll just sell you one right here. Now, the second problem that they faced is buying the things they needed to offer the sacrifices they needed, because you couldn't just use any old money at the temple, because most people, when they used money, would use Roman money, but Roman money has an engraving on it of Caesar. Well, there's a commandment about that. There's a commandment about graven images. You can't spend that money at the table, but conveniently, there's someone who will exchange your kind of icky, earthy money for the special temple money. And that's what the money changers do. Now, as you can imagine, they've got a bit of a lock on the market, and so they can set the exchange rate, and they can set it where they want to set it. And believe it or not, it's not advantageous to the one doing the exchanging. It is, in fact, more advantageous to the one sitting at the table. So when Jesus comes in and turns over the tables and says, you've made my house a den of robbers, he really means it. And it's one of those times in the Bible where we're reminded that when we are asked ourselves that very important question, what would Jesus do, that getting mad and turning over the tables is an option, right? So next time it's like, well, what would Jesus do? I'm like, well, it's actually a wide variety of things open to you when you ask yourself that question. This being one of them. And in the moment, if he gets away with it. So he's able to turn over the money changers, drive them out of the temple, at least for the day, and it looks like he gets away with it. And while the scripture doesn't say this, one thing we do know is that the disciples were all there, and I do wonder if one of the disciples, a gentleman we'll meet later named Judas, didn't take notice of what just happened. Because a lot of the people there, and some of the disciples themselves, actually expected behavior more like this from Jesus. When they thought about a Messiah, what they wanted somebody to do was somebody who was going to drive the Romans out, when they was going to get the evil empire out of Jerusalem, get all of the people who had conspired with the evil empire, which was most of the religious leaders of the day, out of the temple so they could take back their land and rule it themselves. When they thought about a Messiah, they thought that's what they wanted, they thought that's what they were getting, and that's what they hoped Jesus would be. They basically wanted a Moses in reverse. They didn't want a Moses to take them out of the land because they were already where they wanted to be. They wanted a Moses who would kick Pharaoh out. And so when they see Jesus take on the religious leaders and the important people at the temple, no doubt, I do sometimes wonder if Judas hadn't taken notice of that. Because one thing that we tend to understand now is that when Judas does go on to betray Jesus, really what he's trying to do at the end of the day is finally provoke Jesus to fight. He wants Jesus to fight back against the Romans and the religious leaders of the day, and he's not doing it fast enough. But yet here he catches a glimpse. He catches a glimpse of the kind of victory that they want to have. A victory where the people that they don't like are driven out of the place they want to be. Now, I promised Star Wars, and now we're getting there. I know people are like, great. And yes, so this moment is a victory in a lot of ways for Jesus. And for many people, many people at the time may have seen this as the culmination or something big and important to come, just like everything before, all the healing and everything that's happened before was this really important thing that had happened, and that was the culmination of what's to come, and that would be the beginning of the end. And of course, what Jesus knows at the time is that actually the hardest work, the most important work is yet to come. So if you know anything about the story, especially the original version, the original movie of Star Wars, it ends with something very similarly dramatic, right? They spend their whole time gathering all these people up, and at the end of the day, their big goal is to blow up the Death Star, which sounds like something you want to blow up, right? By the way, don't name your thing the Death Star. That's sort of inviting trouble. Right? Like, people aren't going to take kindly to, like, well, the Death Star showed up. I'm like, I wonder what they're here for. Right? Like, that's just bad branding. But there's this story, there's a group of rebels, and of course, Luke Skywalker, who's clearly the Jesus figure, throughout especially the original trilogy. They have this mission to undertake throughout the series, throughout the movie, and of course, the movie ends with this dramatic moment, or nearly ends with this dramatic moment, where they're actually able to succeed, and this small group is able to, overcome, at least in some way, the evil empire. Now, if you have one of those friends, especially one of those, like, more, shall we say, pedantic friends, they might point out that while the destruction of the Death Star is all well and good, it doesn't actually change much about the actual status quo of everybody else. Because destroying the Death Star, yeah, it's important, but the Empire is still intact. Right? And in fact, most of the leadership is still intact. The movie goes out of the way to show us that Darth Vader survives. Spoiler. By some basically happenstance. The emperor is still alive. The empire is still there. And in fact, at this point, the Death Star has only been used like once and a half times, depending on how you think about, the first movie, which is really the fifth movie. This is the sixth movie anyway, it doesn't matter. So the status quo didn't get worse, right? That's what you could say about the destruction of the Death Star. Is the status quo didn't get worse, but it also, from a lot of ways, didn't really get better, right? Everything they're fighting against is still there. And yet, the movie actually ends not with the destruction of the Death Star, but with this really interesting celebration scene where our main characters are gathered down, and there's this big, wonderful, orchestral score, and they're given medals because apparently rebellions have medals. I didn't know they did. Like it's the Olympics. I don't know. By the way, justice to Chewbacca. Where's Chewbacca's medal? He was there the whole time. Poor guy gets left out just because he's a little hairy. But it ends with this celebration scene, and it ends clearly in this moment where people are excited and wanting to celebrate this success that they had. And yet, even at that time, they have to know that the base where they're on has been discovered and they're going to have to leave, and that all the challenges they had before they knew about the Death Star are still there. And the reality is the hardest work that these group will have to do in order to get where they actually want to go, which is kicking the evil empire out, is still all in front of them. And yet, despite that, they take this moment to celebrate. Many of us in life have big goals we want to accomplish. Many of us in life have things we want to be, places we want to be, different things about our lives we wish were different. Some of those are easier to achieve than others. But when we have something in front of us, something important we want to do, somewhere important we want, something we want to accomplish, it can get really hard, it can get really easy to fixate on that final goal and forget to take notice of all the successes along the way. And forget to celebrate all the successes along the way. I don't think the rebellion was foolish for celebrating their success at the moment. They weren't saying we're done. They're not saying all the work is over. They're not saying the empire is gone and all of that. But what they are noticing is that they accomplished something important. They avoided things getting worse, which is oftentimes the most success we can have. Right? It's that famous line, like when you find yourself in the hole, first thing you do is stop digging. And then celebrate the fact that you put the shovel down. And then start worrying about how you're going to fill in the hole and get out. Right? I don't think it's foolish of them to celebrate that. Because what they are also doing in celebrating the success that they've had, is they're recognizing that even though I am not where I want to be yet, progress is possible. Progress is possible. It is possible for things to get better. It is possible for the situation to improve. Even if it isn't all the place I want it to be yet, it is possible that it do so. We celebrate progress because it's important. And we do it to remind ourselves that we can move forward, and we do it because at the end of the day, we each have a choice about how we continue to move forward in life. We can be motivated by what we've accomplished, or we can be discouraged by what still needs to be done. Before I was here, I had a job working for the conference, as many of you know, and I had various responsibilities, but one of my responsibilities was to visit with churches, usually churches that were struggling. And I got to be in that enviable position of coming in and saying, "Hi, I'm from corporate and I'm here to help." Words nobody wants to hear. And whenever I would inevitably sit down with the leadership of a church, the first thing they would want to do is sit there and unload everything they thought was wrong with their world. Everything was wrong with their people, with their church, with their community. Here's all this other stuff. And I would sit there for a few minutes and take notes and all that kind of stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, before we get into that, let me ask you this. What's going well? And then they would look at me, very blank-eyed. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, where are you seeing success? Where are you well? Where is God moving in this place? However you want me to talk about it, I'm willing to ask you the question, but basically, where is the good? You're all still here, right? So there must be some good in this place. Otherwise, why are you here? None of you look that masochistic. And it would take sometimes a very long time to even get the smallest crumb, because they had been, not because they didn't have good things, not because there wasn't good things going on, not because they didn't have things they should or could be celebrating, but they had trained themselves to be so fixated on everything that wasn't the way they wanted it to be. They trained themselves to get so fixated on all the places where they felt like they were failing, that that's all they could see. And they couldn't almost not even see the places where the good was happening. And that's what I told them. And I learned this after a couple of years of doing this work. The communities, churches or otherwise, but the churches and the communities that could learn to see the good, could learn to celebrate the good, could learn to see where God was working, even in big or small, tiny little ways, and could focus on that, had a much higher percentage chance of moving into a healthier place as a whole community than the ones that couldn't. The ones that could never get past the this is wrong, or I don't like this, or this should be different, right? The ones that could never see anything but what was wrong, even if they were right that it was wrong, the ones that could only see that never could make progress in moving forward. Only the ones that could learn to see and celebrate where things were okay, or where good was happening, or where life was moving forward. My one request when I came here when we have our administrative council meetings, when I met with, I can't remember who was ad council chair when I first came. It was Sharon. The one request I think I had when we came was not to move the meetings from 7:30 in the morning, because I thought that was great times. I'm a morning person. Let's meet at 7:30 in the morning. I'm down. But can we add to the agenda right at the top an opportunity, just a quick opportunity for us to share where we have seen God working in our church in the last month? Because administrative council, especially when we're dealing with the day-to-day and that kind of life of the church, it gets really easy to get bogged down in those things that are important. But by starting by celebrating where we had seen God working in our church, it was a nice reminder of why it is we were about to do all the administrative work we were about to do. That it had a purpose, and that purpose was about the good work we do in this place. Learning to make celebration part of our lives, learning to do it even when we don't feel like it, is important. And learning what it actually looks like to celebrate is important too. It's not always about having a big ceremony where we hand out medals. No one's ever given me one. I'm sad. No. Oh, I know. Jim's upset about it, I can tell. I shouldn't say those things out loud. I'm going to have like 6 medals on my desk when I get it's like when I talked about the red shirt, now I've got like 4 red shirts. It's like I have to be careful what I say up here. Sometimes the things we need to celebrate aren't as big and triumphant as destroying the Death Star. Sometimes, especially when life feels really, really hard, the thing we need to celebrate is that we got out of bed in the morning. 2023 did something that I didn't think any year could ever do, which is definitively win worst year ever for me. Literally worst year ever. I cannot and do not want to imagine what could ever possibly top it, nor will I be looking for anything to. 2023, pardon it, sucked for me. I know. And so around the beginning of the year, when I'd run into friends or just people I hadn't seen in a while, they'd ask me how I was doing. And I would say, well, I got through the fall. And they're like, oh, okay. And then I've even said that here. It's like, people say, how are you doing? It's like, well, I got through the fall. And sometimes people respond like, well, don't you remember we did this, this was good, this is wonderful. We had this success in the fall and this thing happened. I'm like, no, time out. You're missing the point. I got through the fall. For me, and everything that happened last year, that was a celebration. Getting through it was a celebration. Getting back to something resembling life in the way that I knew it was something we're celebrating. The way that I celebrate it is to say, yep, I got through it. It didn't destroy me. It didn't ruin me. It didn't ruin my life completely. It didn't ruin my ministry, which I was worried about for a while. We got through it. And in getting through it, I realized this is something I find that I can keep doing. Wasn't sure for a while. Being here is a place I can continue to be. Wasn't here for a while. And if I can get through it in the fall, imagine how much more in the winter and in the spring, in the summer, I might be able to do. We might be able to do together. I celebrate that I got through it. I'm grateful we got through it together. From the outside, it may not look like something all that exciting. But for me, for where I was and where I am today, it was amazing, it was inspiring, and it was life-giving. Sometimes the thing we celebrate is just making it through. And the way that we celebrate it is by recognizing we got through it. Palm Sunday is an opportunity to celebrate. Everything that Jesus did leading up to this moment is not actually the work that we yet need him to do. In many ways, and in fact, in truth, the hardest work is yet to come. But everything that he got through, everything the disciples got through, the years of teaching, the years of healing, all of the hardships that they had suffered and endured together, is something worth taking a moment and raising a palm branch and saying, yes, we got through that. And because they got through that, they will be able, as we know, to get through everything that comes after. The hero's journey includes the abyss. The abyss is actually where we're heading. The abyss will be experienced in the days to come on Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday. And we will emerge on the other side on Easter Sundays, we know, with a transformed Jesus. And in many ways, that transformation is the one that continues to touch us today. But they're going to have to first get through the week to come. They got through everything else, and they know that. And that will give us that will give them the strength for where it is they need to go next. Amen.